Georges St-Pierre, the greatest UFC fighter of all time. 13 straight wins, 2 championship titles, $40 million in the bank. Yet in 2013, he suddenly walked away from the sport at the peak of his fame. Why? The UFC has been hiding the truth for years. What did doctors find in his tests? What terrible secret forced him to give it all up? And why did he say, "I would rather die than come back"? The shocking truth they never wanted you to know. In 2013, Georges St-Pierre was at the peak of his athletic greatness. He was not just a champion, but a living legend, a symbol of invincibility and discipline. His victory over Johnny Hendricks at UFC 167 was supposed to be another triumph, but instead, it became the beginning of the end. That fight, officially recorded as yet another successful title defense, was in reality a physical and psychological hell for George. Later, he admitted that after the final bell, he did not remember several rounds. His consciousness had shut down under the overload. Behind the scenes, something was happening that was carefully hidden from the public. While fans celebrated his victory, St-Pierre was undergoing an intense psychological crisis. His obsessive-compulsive disorder, which had smoldered for years on the fringes of his mind, erupted with destructive force. His rituals turned from strange habits into a genuine prison. He could wash his hands for hours until the skin cracked and bled. Before leaving the house, he would check all the locks dozens of times, returning halfway to ensure the door was truly locked. He was haunted by intrusive thoughts that he might accidentally harm someone close to him. But the real nightmare began before fights. A few days before weigh-ins, panic attacks made him nauseous. He lost sleep and suffered nightmares in which he lost in the most humiliating ways. UFC doctors, conducting mandatory medical examinations, discovered signs of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a brain injury common among long-term fighters. This explained his mood swings, memory problems, and worsening OCD symptoms. The most shocking thing happened when he tried to get help. Instead of support, he faced severe pressure from the organization. Their conversation, which George later described as the most humiliating moment of his career, took place behind closed doors in White's office in Las Vegas. White, known for his pragmatic business approach, listened to him and immediately delivered an ultimatum. He made it clear that in the UFC world, there was no room for human weaknesses. According to George, White's words were harsh and ruthless. The organization could not afford to wait while its champion dealt with his psychological problems. It was made clear that if George did not fight in the next scheduled bout, he would not only be stripped of the title, but everything would be done to erase his legacy. The phrase, "we erase you from history," was not a metaphor. White detailed how this would happen. He would be removed from UFC intro reels, no longer mentioned among the great champions, and his records would be treated as secondary. In a world where legacy is all that remains for a fighter after retirement, this was the harshest form of pressure. At that moment, Georges painfully realized that this realization was even more devastating than his OCD symptoms. He understood that years of loyalty and giving 100% of himself meant nothing to the people who profited from him. His legendary status, his reputation as a model athlete, these were conventions that could be canceled in an instant if he stopped being useful. This conversation became a point of no return. That was when he made the final decision to leave. realizing that he could no longer return to this business of ruthless exploitation. His departure was not an escape from fame, but from a system ready to destroy him to preserve its profits. His exit from the UFC was not a noble retreat or a planned career conclusion. It was a real escape, a desperate leap toward his own salvation. Shortly after that fateful conversation with Dana White, Georges St-Pierre made a decision that shocked everyone around him. He sold his famous Montreal home, which was not just property, but a symbol of his success, a place where he hosted fans and gave interviews to global media. It was a gesture of cutting all retreat paths. He disappeared from the public eye so thoroughly that even his closest friends and training partners did not know his whereabouts for months. Rumors suggested he moved to a remote region of Canada or even left the country. In reality, he deliberately chose a place where no one would recognize him, where he could finally stop being GSP, the sports icon, and simply be Georges, a man trying to piece his psyche back together. The years following his disappearance were devoted to intensive work with psychotherapists and anxiety specialists. He attended multiple sessions a week, dealing not only with OCD consequences, but also with deep trauma caused by betrayal from the organization to which he had given his best years. His therapists helped him rebuild relationships with the world based on acceptance rather than fear and control. His return in 2017 for the fight against Michael Bisping was a surprise for many, but for those who knew the details, it was a calculated move by a man taking control of his career into his own hands. A key condition of that fight was a special contract he personally negotiated, a one-time agreement giving him full control over all aspects of preparation and promotion. UFC could not dictate terms, schedule dates, or demand anything beyond this single fight. It was not just a contract, it was a message. George made it clear that he was returning not to the UFC, but against the UFC on his terms. He was no longer the naive fighter who trusted the organization. Every clause of the agreement was a protective barrier, shielding his mental health from the promotion's toxic influence. He brought his doctors, psychologists, and trusted people, creating a protective bubble inaccessible to UFC representatives. Even his victory over Bisping and winning the middleweight title was not a triumphant comeback, but closure, the final point he himself set. He immediately vacated the title after the fight, showing that he needed not glory, but the satisfaction of proving he could do it on his own terms. His departure after this fight was final, this time forever. He never trusted the UFC again, but more importantly, he never allowed business to define his value as a person. Georges St-Pierre didn't leave because he was afraid to lose. He left because he was afraid of losing his mind. His story is a brutal reminder that the UFC devours its heroes. He saved his sanity, but paid the price of being a perpetual fugitive. If this video hits 100K likes, we'll reveal which substances the UFC hid in his doping tests.